All right, I think we'll get started even as folks are still joining us in the Zoom room. Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. Today's session, postponed from early mid-September, is the William Roger Lewis Lecture, we should really say roundtable, which usually inaugurates the semester. The lecture honors the co-founding chair of the Washington History Seminar, Roger Lewis, with whom I began the series in 2010. At the time, Roger, a former president of the AHA and one of this country's leading historians, directed the National History Center of the AHA, our partner in this undertaking. Over the years, he has led and supported the series in a number of important ways, and today's lecture expresses our deep gratitude for his leadership. Thank you, Roger. This afternoon, we have the great pleasure to speak with Harvard University's Caroline Elkins about her new book, A Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, and GW's Dane Kennedy and Philippa Levine of the University of Texas, Austin. A warm welcome to all of you. In fact, a warm welcome back to Caroline. You've spoken at the seminar before, and of course, Dane, as a former director of the National History Center, has been intimately involved in the Washington History Seminar over the years. So it's great to have you back as a panelist, as a commentator. I'm Christian Ostermann. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the pleasure and really honor to co-chair this seminar with GW's Eric Arnesen, who represents the American Historical Association. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For well over a decade now, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, publications, and insights. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the AHA and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks go to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. This is very much a shoestring operation, and so any support is most welcome. Details on how to do that will now be available in the chat, or simply go to our institutional websites. A couple of technical notes for the discussion later on that we hope will involve many of you in the audience. There are two ways for you to intervene, to join the conversation. Our preferred way to bring you in is for you to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. If you click that, you'll be queued in the lineup, and we will call on you when the moderator, today Eric, will call on you. Please unmute yourself, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. The other way for you to intervene is to post a comment or question in the Q&A functionality as well. Then Eric will put the question or comment to our panelists. I think that's all. Our session today, I should say, will be recorded. So you will be able to view it later on our websites. And with that, I think I'll turn the Zoom room over to Eric. Eric, all yours.
Thank you so much, Christian. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce our author this afternoon. Caroline Elkins is a professor of history and of African and African-American studies at Harvard University, a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School, an affiliated faculty member at the Harvard Law School, and the founding director of Harvard Center for African Studies. She earned her AB from Princeton University and an MA and PhD from Harvard. Among her many awards is a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for general nonfiction for her first book, Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya. And today, she will be talking about her latest book, Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire. Carolyn, it's great to have you. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you so much, Eric, for those generous remarks and introductions. The same to you, Christian, and to my fellow panelists, who I suspect will be introduced when I'm finished, and also my warm welcome to everybody who's joining us via Zoom. As I said, what indeed a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here today. And I've been asked to make some general comments. I'll speak for about 15 minutes or so, give some overview of things, some broad brush strokes of the project that I've been working on, and then very much looking forward to a conversation with Philippa and Dane about not just about the book, but empire more broadly, and to really have an engaging and lively time. And so I could have I think, chosen a bunch of things. And in fact, I could have chosen the recent turn of events at Downing Street, I suppose, to kick us off, but that would have required a quick revision of some of my notes for today. So I'm going to stick with the Queen for the moment. And, think about the Queen's funeral, which was really, I think, an extraordinary affair and pregnant with meaning about the nation's imperial past and the monarchy's very much overdetermined role in it. And as many of us know, grand memorials and statues celebrating empire's heroes proliferated after the Victorian era, and London became very much a kind of imperial and royal playground, if you will. And as we saw, it was center stage for the Queen's funeral. And and I couldn't help, I don't know how many of you were up for the funeral. I certainly was watching as an ethnographer, but, really where even her casket felt the weight of the empire bearing down on it, with the crown and scepter resting on top of it, their jewels extracted of course, from across the empire, including South Africa's famous and massive Cullinan diamond, over 3,000 carats in total. And as the Queen was being laid to rest, imperial history wars, which we're all familiar with in different ways, with the public and politicians and scholars and the media hotly contesting the meanings and lived experiences and legacies of the British Empire, really long simmering, began to explode yet again, or at a minimum, fault lines began to rupture fully. And these imperial history wars and their profound saliency today. And I think the question is, how did we arrive here? And how do we in the present understand the past and the ways in which it shapes the world in which we're living? And it's very much these questions that Legacy of Violence seeks to answer, suggesting it's time to advance our conversation really beyond whether or not empire was a good or bad thing, a force of evil or progress, or to how and why coercion was a cornerstone of Britain's agenda in the empire, its civilizing mission, its white man's burden, if you will. And it's a book that's been well over a decade in the making. I think that's actually charitable. I think it's more than 15 years or so. It's been a while. My publisher could give you the exact amount of time. And the idea for it came from my last book, Imperial Reckoning, which Eric mentioned a moment ago, which sought to establish, at least in my own mind, as fact that Britain deployed systematic violence in Kenya's 1950s detention camps, and then covered it up its own incriminating evidence. And the book then became the evidentiary basis. For the first time, the British government has been sued by a former colonized population in London's High Court. And in 2013, it resulted in a settlement, unprecedented as well, of £20 million sterling, an official apology of sorts, and British government presenting a statue to the victims of British colonial rule in Nairobi. For me, though, questions very much remained. I had clearly dropped into one moment in time with Kenya, and it was part of a much bigger story, a story where imperial agents circulated throughout the 19th and 20th century empire, where coercion and reform rested uncomfortably with each other and were bound together by British liberal imperialism. And this liberal imperialism was thought to be unique. Its civilizing mission would bring developmentalism with a heavy paternalistic hand to some 700 million colonial subjects across about a quarter of the world's landmass, the largest empire in history. But liberal imperialism with its coercion and reform was very much, I argue, an oxymoron, a kind of dualism that can only be explained if we keep them in the same frame of historical analysis. If we ask how and why the coercion and reform were very much two sides of empire's developmentalist coin. And briefly, let's unpack this dualism of coercion and reform. And because after Britain waged about some 250 wars in the 19th century to extend sovereignty over vast swaths of territory that ostensibly never had it, and to quote unquote pacify colonial subjects, a contested though coherent ideology of liberal imperialism emerged that integrated sovereign imperial claims with what was really a huge undertaking to reform colonial subjects, often called, as we know, children. And the idea being that through tutelage and developmentalist policies, Britain would usher hundreds of millions of people into the modern world, determining when these subject populations, mostly, of course, brown and black, were civilized and prepared to, if you will, to stand on their own feet to achieve independence. But if Britain's civilizing mission was reformist in its claims, it was very much brutal nonetheless. And as the book discusses at length, nationalists and freedom fighters were often cast as criminals or terrorists in their actions, including labor strikes or vandalism, riots, full-blown rebellions, were very much political threats. And coercion would not just subdue these so-called, if you will, recalcitrant children. Colonial officials and security forces very much wanted, and I think this is important, they wanted their infantilized subjects to feel and see their own suffering. And British officials had a term for this, and it's a term called the quote-unquote moral effect of violence, and something, again, that the book really traces the arc of the development of this term over time and place. And at the same time, British officials absolutely obsessed over the rule of law, insisting that it was the basis of good government. But in the empire, rule of law codified difference, it curtailed freedoms, it expropriated land and property, ensured a steady stream of labor for the empire's mines and plantations, the profits from which, of course, helped to fuel Britain's economy. And by the 20th century, the empire was replete with legal exceptionalism in the form of martial law, and states of emergency needed to maintain control. And while lawful, these states of exception granted extraordinary powers of repression, something, again, the book really unpacks. And when security forces needed more discretion, or when their actions constituted unsanctioned violence, British officials rendered their behavior illegal by amending old regulations and creating new ones. And this process of making legal otherwise illegal behavior and protecting British security forces from prosecution is something that I term legalized lawlessness. And indeed, this recurring phenomenon turned the exceptions into the norms, and British security forces deployed ever-intensifying forms of systemic violence, making the empire look more and more like a recurring conquest state. And a well-oiled repressive machinery emerged, very much directed from London, and then transferred from one imperial location to the next by colonial officials and security forces. And just briefly, if we sort of unpack sort of the arc of this in terms of temporally, prior to the Second World War, these processes of systematized repression played out across the empire, and a lot of scenes that some may well be familiar with: South Africa, India, Ireland, Palestine, to name but a few. But it's in the post-war period that we see liberal imperialism facing its greatest test. It was a time when, in theory, promises of wartime freedom would be kept, but instead Britain embarked on a broad policy of imperial resurgence, first under Labour's Attlee government, and then under a succession of conservative governments, Churchill and then Eden and Macmillan. And the empire, it was thought, would rescue Britain from its financial perils, or financial Armageddon, as Keynes called it, and also secure its place among the big three. So in many ways, the empire was, one can look at it and say it was on an overdetermined collision course. In the first 3 decades after World War II, in fact, the first 30 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, a reign that was, like those before and the current one after her, shaped and defined, I would argue, by a kind of imperial nationalism. These 3 decades were punctuated by recurring end of empire wars, beginning in Malaya, then in Kenya, Cyprus, British Guiana, Nyasaland, Aden, Northern Ireland, to name but a few locations. And again, it's something where the book is unpacking these and tracing sort of the arc and the movement of people and ideas from place to place. And British security forces, in an effort to regain imperial control, moved through this empire, unleashing wide-scale detention without trial and illegal deportations. Malaya and Kenya, they forcibly relocated hundreds of thousands of subjects into barbed wire villages, where forced labor and starvation were forms of colonial control. In each conflict, kill squads were deployed and populations terrorized. And I'm not going to get into sort of a lot of the specific details from place to place, but I think what's quite interesting about this story, at least in my mind, was the degree to which they become better and more systematic over time. And the tracing of this as we go through the book and understanding how these forms and practices are being transferred, not just, if you will, in a kind of hub and spokes model from London and out into the empire and back again, but also, if you will, kind of around the rim of empire as people are moving, not from sort of Malaya back to London to Kenya, but from Kuala Lumpur to Nairobi and so forth. Now, Throughout all of this, liberal imperialism endured, I suggest, with its elasticity giving rise to new lexicons for reform. So, for example, colonial subjects were being, quote unquote, rehabilitated in unprecedented hearts and minds campaigns after the Second World War. Updated post-war humanitarian laws and new human rights conventions, legally and obviously politically problematic, particularly on Britain's widespread use of torture, particularly prompted such doublespeak when British governments repeatedly denied repressive measures. And I think this is the important thing to point out as well. Consistently, what we're seeing happening is that each instance of brutality is explained away as being isolated. This was a result of a bad apple. This is an exception. And of course, one that begs the question of how many exceptions do you have until the exception is no longer exceptional. And of course, this, it takes me about 800 pages plus, but we really unpack that within the context of legacy of violence. And just a last few words about sort of the writing of the book itself. To tell the fullness of the story, I set out to research and write a history of the British Empire through the lens of state-directed violence and the ways in which, I think importantly, the ways in which Britons at home and in the empire worked and reworked and understood colonial violence as part of the liberal imperial project. And I think that was one thing that very much, in my mind, animated some of the questions that I was wrestling with in the context of this book. Not just what was happening out in empire, but how did those in empire understand what they were doing, and how did those at home process the ways in which violence was coming back home from the empire? And of course, it was despite all the cover-ups, despite all the document destruction that we know of, it was actually quite remarkable how reasonably well-informed populations were at home about the violence that was unfolding. And so the question becomes, how is it that this becomes internalized and explained away in such a way that, as we know, there continues to remain in some circles today very much a strong notion of British exceptionalism when it comes to the empire and when it comes to violence. And I should make it very clear, which I didn't state up front, and that is, we know that all empires are violent. This is not, and I say this quite clearly in the book itself. And to me, one of the questions that I try to raise and that I seek to answer, and that is, in very few nations today do we see empire sort of animating and informing political, economic, and social decision-making, if you will. We have a few others. Russia would be one of them, but it's very much salient and present in the here and now. And I think in that sense, it begs explanation. And I think in some ways, this book is trying to both take readers into sort of the depths of different places within the empire itself, as well as bring us back home, back to the UK, to understand how these moments are being processed and how this fits into the much larger picture. And last but not least, I'll make one last point before I turn it over to my fellow panelists. And that is, when I began this book, I really thought that this was going to be a book about violence in the British Empire after the Second World War, about counterinsurgencies post-war. And several things intervened, and insofar as changing the temporal time frame of it. And some of which was the absence of documents, which, of course, in the context of the case that I referred to in a moment ago, there's a large discovery of documents in the case of the Hanslope disclosure, sort of forcing a going through of all those documents before I can actually finish the research on the book. And, while there's some important things, that there are no massive smoking guns. And so what we begin to, my point is that as historians, we start thinking about how is it that I can get to some of the answers that I'm seeking to give to the questions that I'm asking. And that was to move the time frame and to say, okay, let's move myself back in time. And I have to say, it was the best thing that I ever did in my own mind, just in terms of my own research, because I think we really do have a bit of an artificial dividing line often with World War II. And to me, and we can sort of, depending on where we go in the conversation, I really very much believe that Palestine in the 1930s becomes extremely important to understanding the ways, the structures, the legal regimes, the practices that unfold post-World War II, and frankly, even during the Second World War. And so in that sense, this book really does, it opens up with the Hastings trial and brings us all the way to the Mau Mau trial, really as bookends to the book, but takes us through the first part of really examining the pre-World War II period in some depth before moving us into the Second World War. And then, of course, bring us to the present day, and I'll end here, which I hope we'll have some conversation about. And that is, what does all this mean in the here and now, and the legacies of violence, as I call it, in the British Empire? And I think we see it both in the empire itself and in the form of variety of things, in terms of cultures and nations being born out of cauldrons of violence, in terms of legal codes, which are very much enabling of a kind of liberalism in which violence adheres to it. I think this, make no mistake, this has been raised before, but this book is certainly a critique of liberalism in different ways. And then the question becomes, how is it within that critique that we can understand both Britain as well as, in part, and I want to be careful about not having overreach, but in part sort of asking questions about the liberal project in general and the degrees to which maybe an analysis of the British Empire is helpful to us in understanding the processes and patterns that brought us to where we are today. So I will pause here. I think I've hit about somewhere in between my 15 and 20 minute mark, and look forward to a fun, engaging, lively conversation.
All right, then, let's move toward that conversation. Thank you so much. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dane Kennedy, a professor emeritus at the George Washington University and the past director of the National History Center of the American Historical Association. He received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and he is the author of 7 books and the editor or co-editor of 3 more. Among his recent publications are The Imperial History Wars, Debating the British Empire, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2018, Decolonization, A Very Short History, Oxford University Press, 2016, and The Last Blank Spaces, Exploring Africa and Australia, published by Harvard University Press in 2013. Dane, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. You have been a fixture with the seminar for many, many years. Good to see you again.
You as well. Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. First of all, Carolyn, congratulations on the book. It is truly a monumental work of scholarship. Anyone who's looked at it can attest to that fact. It occurs to me, these aren't in my formal remarks, but I thought I should also mention to those who are listening who may not be aware of Carolyn's background, that in addition to writing a Pulitzer Prize-winning book and this latest work, she has done something which is really exceptionally rare for historians. She was one of the lead historians in the court case that a number of Mau Mau detainees pressed against the British government. And won in, 2012? I can't remember now, but this was an extraordinary achievement and spoke to the issue that she's raised here today about how the past and the present really are profoundly intertwined in important ways. And so it's rare to have a historian who is also, in this sense, someone who's had a direct and powerful impact on the lives of contemporary ex-colonial peoples. So while reading the book, I was actually reminded, first and foremost, of some comments that a colleague of mine, an American historian, made to me after he returned from his first trip to Britain. And this was decades ago when I was at the University of Nebraska. He was struck by the fact that so many British churches were festooned with battle flags, filled with memorials to the war dead, and so on. Now, sure. A lot of these memorials were concerned with those who had died in the First and Second World War, and that's hardly surprising. But many of them concerned Britain's imperial wars. And it wasn't until he brought this fact to my attention that I suddenly realized, yeah, he's right. I would go to these churches and I would see that memorials to imperial wars I'd never even heard of. Now, I should say that most Britons probably have overlooked this as well. And that's really the point. It's this willful blindness to the deadly human consequences of empire that your book, Carolyn, insists on confronting. And in that regard, it is, like most good history, as much about the present as it is about the past. It's an important rejoinder, in particular, to those contemporary voices in Britain who insist that their empire was more noble and less violent than other empires. You pretty effectively dismiss that canard. I should add, of course, that your book is less about the people that were memorialized in those churches, that is, the many Britons who died making the empire, than about the far larger number of colonized peoples who died resisting it. And you tell this important, if depressing, story, in part by making very good use of the abundant scholarship that already exists on particular colonial conflicts. But you do much more than simply synthesize the scholarship. Your book is the product of a really daunting amount of original archival research, and for that, we're all in your debt. You also cover a lot of ground in this 800 pages of text, not surprisingly. The book starts in the mid-19th century. It picks up steam in the early 20th century, and of course, it reaches its climax with the mid-century wars of decolonization. In 2011, Richard Gott, the veteran Guardian journalist, wrote a book titled Britain's Empire, Resistance, Repression, and Revolt, a book that covered Britain's wars of imperial conquest from the founding of empire in the 16th century to the Indian Rebellion in 1857. And your work, in some sense, is a kind of sequel. It takes the story from 1857 to the end of empire and beyond. And so if you read them together, these two books make it clear that violence was endemic to British imperial ambitions from beginning to end. Now, given this fact, I began to think about your argument that liberal imperialism lay at the heart of this violence. And this is an issue that you obviously have addressed in your remarks today, and which are absolutely central to the argument of the book as a whole, and something that I think perhaps we could explore in a little more depth. And so I want to raise a couple of questions about this for you, and to some degree perhaps you've answered them, but we might be able to explore them a bit further. So one question I have is this, and that is, what makes the violence that you attribute to liberal imperialism different from the violence that occurred, as Gott shows, in the centuries before liberal imperialism appeared on the scene? And there are obviously different ways of responding to that. Is the difference an instrumental one? That is to say, is there really a difference of intent and outcome? Or is it simply a rhetorical difference, a spruced up way of rationalizing what all empires do? Perhaps another way of asking this question is to frame it in terms of that compelling phrase that you use in the book to describe liberal imperialism and that you've referred to in your remarks, and that is legalized lawlessness. So were the oppressive measures you rightly characterized as lawless the state's response to emergencies that it believed made extra legal measures necessary and justified? Or was the law per se merely a veneer for an imperial state that was by its very nature lawless? And this leads to a second and related question. And again, you've really touched on this in your remarks, but I'd like you to sort of perhaps address them more directly. And that is what you see as the relationship between liberal imperialism and liberalism itself. I mean, one choice is that liberalism is simply, liberal imperialism is merely a corruption of liberalism, a distortion of liberal principles on behalf of the extortionate exploitation of empires. The other is that liberal imperialism is in fact integral to liberalism, that it's the worm in the bud. And I gather from reading the book that you take the second stance. You refer to liberalism's perfidiousness. You talk about repression as being an enduring feature of liberal states. And if that's the case, what are we to make of those colonized subjects who embraced liberal ideas like free speech, equality under the law, and so forth in their independence movements, were they themselves unaware that liberalism was their enemy? Or were they using its rhetorical claims to expose liberalism's own inherent contradictions and the corruption of British rule? So those are the issues that I'd be interested in having you sort of say a bit more about. And finally, if you have the time, I would really love to hear how British reviewers have responded to your book. But finally, once again, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Dane. Carolyn, do you care to tackle those questions now?
Sure. I mean, we could do this in 30. They're small questions, you know. They're just great questions, Dane. And, you know, I mean, these are things you just like, I love just exchanging ideas with you because you put your finger right on really, I think, some things that I wrestled with in putting this book together, right? I mean, one way of writing a book like this is just a chronology of horrible events. Like you could just write a chronology of horrible, you know, but I think, you know, what has very much, look, I think as historians, we wake up and we have burning questions we want to answer. Like that's what gets me up out of bed every day. And it did for many, many years with this book. And you know, one of the things that struck me so much in the Kenya book, and I was fortunate in that book, and this brings me to your questions, Dane. I was fortunate in that book where many, many former colonial officers were very much alive. And I got to interview most of them in the context of Kenya, as well as missionaries, members of the security forces. You know, and what struck me, and it touches a little bit on your first question in terms of my prisoner's dilemma, do I want door A or door B as I go down some of your questions, right? But how much, if we try to explain away, if you will, liberal imperialism, however we want to call it, civilizing mission, as just a rhetorical, one big rhetorical gesture, we're going to get ourselves into trouble. Because what we're suggesting is that those on the spot didn't believe in what they were doing, that it was just, they too thought this was window dressing. And what struck me about this, and what struck me even in the most extreme of circumstances, the Kenya detention camps, of how it wasn't just the language and the performance of reform. There was the sense, and I think this is something that's very important, and brings me to your first question. There was the sense that violence was inherently reformative. So yes, education and civics classes, but it gets back to something I open up in the book with, which is, you know, sort of the Christian proverb, you know, paraphrasing, spare the rod, spoil the child. That this sense that the moral effect of violence, that there was something out of the suffering and pain of systematized violence and torture, there was, if you will, a kind of developmentalism coming out of even these extreme moments. And I think it's important, that's where I get back to the dualism, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, where we do have to hold violence or coercion and reform in the same window of in the same analysis, right? That we can't, because we don't in general, if we even go back to some of the big thinkers in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill and James Fitzjames Stephen, who was on the opposite end of the spectrum thinking about, but they were vexed by this question about violence in the empire and they couldn't hold this dualism. And it was interesting. It was, and I say this in the book, you know, it's the humanists who can. It's Robert Louis Stevenson who talks about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and who, of course, in part, depending on how you read this, is talking in part about empire. But when man can contain both. And so I don't want to get too esoteric here, but the point being that, you know, getting to this question about, inherent in some of the question you're asking me is also about structure and ideology, right? And I make this I'm quite purposefully sort of threading the needle on that. And what I'm saying is that structure and ideology are mutually constitutive, that if you take either route, you're going to get yourself into trouble trying to understand how this violence is unfolding. And I think it gets us really, though, to this bigger question. One, you asked me what makes violence, basically what's the difference between what Gott's talking about, what I'm talking about, right? And then how does that bring us to the question about what's the difference between liberal imperial, or how does one understand liberal imperialism and liberalism? I think, first of all, to me, one of the big differences, if you will, and by the way, I think Gott's work is tremendous, that what he's up to, what I'm up to, and that is in 19th century, we are seeing a shift in the way in which we're thinking about empire and violence and reform. right? And I think in that sense, and I'm not introducing, this is where I really am drawing upon the work of others, but particularly those in political theory, Karuna Matenya, Mehta, others. When we see what happens in the 19th century, when liberalism washes up on distant shores and the notion of these universalisms begin to wither, right? And the question becomes, and so what I'm picking up from them is they're bringing us to the theoretical, right? Where in fact, we do see this notion of something is different in the 19th century. What happens when it extends to empire? What I'm asking the question of is what happens when we actually look at the practical day-to-day implications of the extension of liberal imperialism in the 19th century and beyond. How is it that we understand, and how did people think about at the time what their actions did and how we reconcile violence with reform? Because I think the important thing to point out, Dane, is that consistently violence and reform, coercion and reform, and not with everybody, but with many, can be reconciled, right? And it's often, and as you probably may have recalled from reading the book, I'm very attuned to language, how they're describing this, the terms that are used to understand, how and why coercion is banned. If we can go to Amritsar and diaries talking about the moral effect of violence. We go to Chaim Weitzman in Palestine. He's talking about the moral effect of violence. When we get to Kenya, we're talking no longer moral effect of violence because it's no longer fashionable. We call it rehabilitation. But it does bring this to the last question about liberalism and liberal imperialism. And I think, my response would be that, and also you asked the question of what happens to those in the empire who, if you will, internalize liberalism, right? And sort of, claims to free speech, et cetera. And, look, I think when I think about liberal imperialism and the usefulness of thinking about the relationship between violence, coercion, and reform, and this developmentalist model, right, which ultimately is embedded, it's not just British, it's embedded in international accords, right? This not yet that getting to language, that for those who are not yet ready to stand on their own, for those who are not yet, and that is in the League of Nations documents, we see this in the UN documents, we see this in sort of international language as well as British language, that at some point, but not yet, Black and brown and subject populations will be ready to stand on their own. And the point that I make in the book is that this not yet never really comes, right? It's demanded at the time of independence. And the question that I think that we need to be thinking about today is, has not yet arrived, right? For many, when we think about, and getting back to notions of liberal imperialism and how it can be external or internal, when we think about the ways in which the lack of inclusion, the lack of integration, all the kinds of things that we are, when we think about even, I'm sort of really spinning out here, but we think about things like affirmative action and other kinds of excuses as to why we don't see more, if you will, diversity. Why don't we see more inclusion of citizenship, et cetera, et cetera? It's often framed in this developmentalist language. That that would be great, but they're just not yet enough people ready for X, right? When we see the ways in which Britain post 1948 and Windrush, and the ways in which we see immigration laws rolled back. And that's why if I had time, I really would have opened up with something with the current prime minister today, because I think it's very interesting into this narrative. But in all seriousness, when we think about the rolling back of immigration laws, it's impossible to disentangle from notions of liberal imperialism that had unfolded for nearly a century prior to empire coming home after 1948. And so I think in that sense, when I think about a critique of liberalism, liberalism in some ways, if we really want to be quite reductive about it, it is, applying to a particular group of, you will, privileged and power of individuals. And this brings me to the last point. They can be white and male, but it can be applicable to other parts if we look at Modi's India today or look at elsewhere in the empire, right? There's ways in which within liberalism that certain people of identities can be privileged. It doesn't necessarily have to be a white and if you will, white and black scenario. But I think, yes, I think the easy answer to your last question, Dane, and that is, it was the internalization of liberalism. And we see that I use less of the Indian nationalists than I do those from the West Indies. I could have picked anywhere, but I was quite intrigued with the ways in which people like George Padmore in particular are speaking about this. But they're using liberalism to critique Britain on its own terms. And they're very, very good at it. And, I found, there's lots of folks who have written on this before, so I'm certainly not even close to the first one, but I find that literature strikingly interesting. And also not just and I'll end on this point, not was it only that they're critiquing liberalism on its own terms, but at the same time, they were showing people like Fenner Brockway and others how to address the questions of violence. And you address the question of violence and critiques of the questions of violence, much like human rights organizations do today, through the collection of data, through the use of numbers and figures and the rest. And I think in that sense, it's not just the critique of liberalism that individuals from the empire are bringing to the table. They're also bringing about ways in how to directly confront head on through legal mechanisms, as well as through data collection mechanisms, how they can document the kinds of violence and coercion that are taking place. And so I have gone on for long enough, but those are fantastic questions. I could keep talking about it. And look, I think it's probably, you asked me how it was received in the UK. Before I move on, I think that this element of really sort of the book itself being an inherent critique of liberalism is something that has raised a lot of, a lot of discussion, if you will, which I've quite enjoyed. And I think one of the things that and I should mention this, in the book I say in the introduction that while I certainly believe in any book about violence in the empire is going to have an economic dimension to it. I don't think we can explain all of the coercion and violence in empire through racial capitalism alone. And I really fundamentally believe that. And I think that if we start looking in places that we don't usually look, like, as you're saying, cries for freedom, like arenas that are supposed to be ensuring justice, we're finding them there. Not just in labor lines, not just on plantations and mines. And I think that begs explanation, and that's in part what I'm up to. In the UK, it's interesting. And I think this suggests, first of all, it's a very different kind of book than the first book. I think it's much more meditative and sort of, as I said, in my own mind, for my own self, one that was really trying to get at this how and why question. But the first two reviews, one was The Guardian and one was the FT, both of which, sort of, if you will, kind of left in sort of right-ish. I think that's fair enough to say. And, quite thoroughgoing, quite positive. And so I think, and obviously there's been plenty of, as one would find in an 800-page book, critiques of different things. But I've found that the receptiveness to a conversation like what we're having today on both sides of the pond is quite different than 15 years ago. And I think it shows us how quickly, and I'm speaking to two people here who are at the forefront of this field, how quickly this field has moved and how salient these, to the title of your book, Dane, how salient the imperial history wars are, and how much we all collectively, and I really underscore that, have to contribute as we think about sort of where from here, both in our field, but also as it plays out literally on the streets and in Parliament and elsewhere, the importance of our work and getting it into sort of the public realm.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, just a note to those of you in the audience, remember, you can use the raise hand function, or you can post a question in the Q&A function. We've got several already, but now is a fine enough time to get in the queue should you wish to do so. All right. It's a pleasure to introduce Philippa Levine, the Walter Prescott Webb Chair in History and Ideas at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is also director of the British, Irish, and Empire Studies program. Educated at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, she writes on the British Empire and especially on science and medicine. Among her publications are The British Empire, Sunrise to Sunset, published in 2020, Eugenics, A Very Short Introduction, published in 2017, and Prostitution, Race and Politics, Policing Venereal Disease in the British Empire, published in 2003. Philippa, welcome to the seminar.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to read my comments, mostly because whilst it was an immense pleasure and an honor to read Carolyn's book, it's also daunting. 800 pages, lots to remember. And I knew that if I didn't write it down and read it, I would not do justice to the book. So bear with me in that respect. But really, it was a privilege and a pleasure to be invited to comment on and think about this very important work by one of our finest historians. So here we go. Capitalizing on her work on the British use of terror and torture in 1950s Kenya, Caroline Elkins has, in this new book, turned her attention to the broader British Empire, arguing that under the guise of the rule of law, Britain's empire was systematically conquered, maintained, and of course ultimately lost through the most violent and brutal of means. From Aden to Malaya, from Cyprus to Jamaica, from India to the Middle East, over and over again, British officials either ignored, advocated, or justified vast amounts of horrific violence against anti-colonial protesters and resistors, as well as those unwittingly caught in the crossfire. The tale Elkins tells is exhausting and dispiriting in its completeness, a relentless and ugly catalogue of calculated inhumanity. In this sense, this is not a pleasant book to read, but it's not meant to be a pleasant book to read. This is a serious topic handled here with gravity, but also with anger, not only at the actions of politicians, soldiers, and others involved in colonial misdeeds, but of the subsequent cover-ups which allowed the vast majority of the perpetrators not merely to go free, but in some cases to enjoy rewards for their actions. Elkins herself became enmeshed in one such court case, and both she and Dane have mentioned this, a celebrated legal trial that unfolded from 2011 around the claims of elderly survivors of the Mau Mau terror campaign waged against Kikuyu peoples in East Africa in the 1950s. This case would end rather differently than the majority, where the perpetrators were exonerated. After deliberate attempts by the government to stall or to shutter the case, the revelation that a vast cache of documents had miraculously shown up in an obscure government building in a rural location in the south of England turned the tables on the obfuscation long used to limit damage to the reputation of the government and the lives of its foot soldiers. The legal defense team for the Kenyan survivors and their expert witnesses, Caroline amongst them, won the case, a story that Elkins tells in the gripping last chapter of the book, where she describes the unexpected acquiescence of the government's lawyers as claimants described in harrowing detail the appalling tortures they had undergone. The government disputed none of the testimony and ultimately made a public acknowledgement that the colonial administration had adopted tactics the statement described as, and I quote, abhorrent violations of human dignity. No kidding. Thrilling as this was at the time, and as a fitting end to this book, Elkins is at pains to ensure that we do not and cannot understand the Kenyan case as aberrant. For her, it was anything, it is anything but. Indeed, one of the principal arguments of the book is that such violence was, in fact, business as usual. A necessary tool in the weaponry deployed to quell unrest, sabotage activism, necessary tool in the weaponry deployed to quell unrest, sabotage activism, forgot that was a verb, deter protest, and silence critics. This won't be news to professional historians who work in this arena. The violence of the British Empire and of modern European imperial power more broadly writ has been, I would suggest, the dominant interpretation within scholarly circles, certainly since the 1990s. The revitalization of work on imperialism that accompanied the so-called post-colonial turn in the final decades of the 20th century was characterized by its refusal to see power as a one-way street emanating from the centre, and by its insistence on critically investigating the rationales driving imperial expansion. A slew of influential commentators, prominent amongst the remarkable trio of political scientists who Caroline just mentioned, laid the groundwork for her argument that 19th century liberalism at the very least accommodated empire and was complicit in the violence without which it could not function. Uday Singh Mehta's 1990 book, Liberalism and Empire. 6 years later, Jennifer Pitt's A Turn to Empire. And in 2010, Karuna Mantena's Alibis of Empire, all skewered British claims of a progressive and beneficent imperial rule born of civilization, instead seeing liberalism as a partner in a growing empire foundationally premised on violence as a means to subjugate and dispossess indigenous peoples. But if the professional historical view of Britain's motive and conduct in its imperial possessions poured cold water on the message of a civilizing mission, that assessment had rather less truck beyond academic circles. As Caroline and others have noted, in the popular imagination, a very different opinion generally holds sway. Popular works on the British Empire, television programmes, and culture war manifestos that originate largely among conservative politicians and their allies continue in large part to represent the British Empire as both beneficent and, crucially, far less prone to violence and corruption than its European competitors. Apologists for the British Empire point piously to atrocities committed by other colonial powers, Belgium in particular, but by no means the only allegedly guilty party. Such denial is not unique to Britain, though it remains, I would argue, the most prominent case of what is in effect a profound and awfully convenient historical amnesia. And I truly appreciate the window that Caroline offers us into a world twisted by racial hatred and self-delusion, her robust insistence on revealing the hypocrisy on a grand scale at the heart of liberal imperialism. I don't for a moment mean to suggest that the British public passively accepts a vision of the empire as benevolent, or that the public has been duped while professionals remain clear-eyed and hard-headed. The reality is obviously far more complex, and even media outlets have ventured into the same territory as Caroline, most notably the two-part series made for France's Arte TV, Décolonisation, which aired in late 2019. The recent rows in Britain over the Colston and Rhodes statues demonstrate that a good deal of public opinion does recognize the violence built into imperialism, and yet imperial nostalgia and a belief that empire was what made Britain great remain nonetheless tenacious and ubiquitous ideas, immensely useful to politicians, and in the past few years a critical element in the debate over Britain's withdrawal from Europe. Perhaps Caroline's book, this record of unremitting brutality airbrushed by a constant invocation of the rule of law, may move the dial a little. We can but hope. There are three questions I'd like to submit to Caroline for Caroline's consideration today. The first of which is directly related to this last point. Why is it that Britain seems so much more successful in selling the lie of its beneficence, globally as well as nationally, than have other imperially minded nations? Why has that characterization of the British Empire stuck? Apologists for empire, Elkins names Niall Ferguson and Andrew Roberts as two of the major protagonists, vigorously insist that Britain ruled its far-flung possessions far less violently than its European competitors, and as a result enjoyed a good deal of cooperation from its imperial subjects. Elkin's book is hardly the first to contradict those claims. The tumultuous years of decolonization, the many decades of unrest that preceded them, the long history of both violent and non-violent conflict in every nook and cranny of empire hardly suggest a quiescent and content subject populace grateful for British attention and order, or indeed much long-term success for the empire. And yet this myth of Britain as the better, the best imperial ruler, the least brutal, the most civilized, lives on. I thought hard about this over the years in my own work and have never found a wholly satisfactory explanation for why this might be. Having written this particular book, one determined to shatter that myth and to reveal the often hidden ferocity by which imperial rule was so frequently sustained. I'm wondering if Caroline has some ideas on why a significant section of the British public, and certainly many politicians, mostly on the right, still hew so very vigorously to this view. Earlier this year, the then Minister for Education, and good luck keeping up with who's ministers in Britain right now in any of the portfolios, but earlier this year, the then Minister for Education, Nadim Zahawi, and the former Equalities Minister, Kimi Badenoch, insisted that school children be taught the benefits as well as the black spots of the British Empire, a doctrine enshrined into law in February 2022 by guidelines on so-called political impartiality in schools. Their particular voices, that's Zahawi and Badenoch, were strategically important for the Conservative position, as both hail from colonial immigrant families, respectively from Iraq and Nigeria, and both have vehemently insisted that discussions of racism and criticisms of empire are little more than appeals to victimhood, more on which in a moment. In Conservative circles, the disempowerment this implies is, of course, anathema, since it undermines the fundamental doctrine of individual success to which both of these champions of Britain proudly adhere. I suppose I'm formulating here the beginnings of an answer to my own question, an answer moreover that presupposes that current government rules about the educational curriculum would absolutely preclude the use of Caroline's work in schools. I wonder whether she'd care to comment further on this conundrum and on the current culture wars in which her book will inevitably be enmeshed. And of course, she did some of that in her own remarks. So, that may be redundant. In short, though, how did the narrative of Britain as a reluctant and civilizing force for good manage to stick in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary? And is it, as it were, stickier now at a time when the onslaught on educational institutions is becoming so acute, and not just in the UK, of course? I said I would return to the question of victimhood. A conservative argument that criticism of empire reduces colonial subjects to victims and thus strips them of individuality, of agency, and of a voice is a very clever reimagining of a position long since refined in radical history circles, where feminists in particular have rejected the depiction of women as defined solely by their status as victims of male rapacity and control. Sunil Khilnani, reviewing Caroline's book in the New Yorker in April this year, gently suggests that at times she may come close to reducing colonial subjects to victims, and that in emphasizing their vulnerability to colonial violence, Caroline may perhaps unintentionally revitalizes an older imperial history that privileged the corridors of Whitehall and high politics over grassroots activism. It's as if, he writes, the ghosts of imperial history that she set out to vanquish had returned to inhabit her book. Is the argument that Caroline makes possible without that reductiveness? Is it, in essence, a requirement of a book that sees violence as a totalizing manifestation of power? How much room does it leave for the post-colonial argument that in reality empire was always fragile, always unstable, forever seeking to shore up what it knew could easily be lost? Was the violence she so painstakingly and meticulously details a reaction to uncertainty and the fear of losing it all? One of the main arenas in which the politics of victimhood within empire has played out, and not surprisingly, is slavery. And I would like to ask why Caroline chose not to engage in a more detailed fashion with slavery, so manifestly a form of colonial violence and yet barely tackled here. And yes, I know it's an 800-page book and it's probably the reason, but still, I think it bears asking nonetheless. The book is focused largely on the later 19th and overwhelmingly the 20th century, as you, of course, yourself have said today. There certainly are good reasons to highlight these later eras, characterized as they were by greater imperial competition and expansion. But the forms of slavery associated with colonialism surely lie at the heart of the violence so vividly described in this volume, and were likewise, and not just in the British Empire, justified and maintained via legal strategies that did all the things that Caroline sees as typical of the empire's violence. They distinguished on the basis of race and did so hierarchically. They dispossessed millions and rendered them little more than a renewable supply of coerced labor. And they achieved all of this under the guise of the rule of law. Slavery deployed violence to create a workforce and then to keep that workforce subjugated. And despite the pride Badenoch, Zahawi, and other conservative politicians appear to take in Britain's abolition of the slave trade in the 1830s, it unhesitatingly used violence to quell both the newly emancipated and the largely indentured migrants who so often replaced slaves in the cotton and tobacco fields, the sugar mills, and elsewhere after abolition. And just as an aside, the celebratory narrative of British abolitionism conveniently ignores the abolition of its slave trade by the Danish Empire. Britain was not the lone and brave pioneer the narrative of the conservatives suggests. Yet in this text of some 700 or 800 pages, the violence inherent in colonial slavery receives scant attention. The 1865 rebellion at Morant Bay in Jamaica, in which hundreds of former slaves lost their lives either in fighting or via the hangman's noose, is one of Caroline's starting points, along with the Indian Rebellion a decade earlier. But beyond that, the book has little to say about slavery's key role in sustaining imperial success. It's worth reiterating that the abolition of Atlantic slavery had scant effect on slavery elsewhere in the empire. And as recent work by a team of UK-based historians has demonstrated, even long after abolition in the West Indies, many wealthy Britons received compensation and slave-derived investment wealth. And some of this investment was earned directly from the manufacture of artifacts of violence, chains, cuffs, and fetters, as well as goods used to barter for slaves in Africa. The spectral violence of slavery, then, I want to argue, cannot be underestimated even into the 20th century. I've really appreciated this opportunity to read and to engage with Caroline over this important and deeply disturbing new book, which I hope will re-energize a long-standing debate about the particulars of British imperial rule, but also about the wider remit and intent of imperialism and the crude and vicious violence built into its very fabric, its very origin. Imperialism is by nature subjugation, and more often than not on a grand scale. Elkins helps us name that and remember that. And for this accomplishment, she has my profound gratitude. Thank you.
Philippa, thank you so much. Carolyn, ball's in your court.
Thank you, Eric. Philippa, that was extraordinary. Thank you. I am madly taking notes, if only because I'm not going to get to all of it in this conversation, but just to reflect on. I mean, so many, as well as you, David, but you've just, Philippa, laid out so many important and things to really, as I said, ruminate on. And let's start with the first one, which is, sort of how did this myth of exceptionalism persist? You said it far more eloquently than I did, but I think this is, and as you suggested your own self, you've wrestled with this, right? And I think this is something we all wrestle with. There's the classic Orwell, if you take away empire, all that's left is sort of a craggy cold island with potatoes and herring, all right? And so, and I think we can start with a little tongue in cheek that way, but I think the question to me, and something we haven't touched on as much, and again, it's nothing, I'm drawing on the work of so many others, but this notion of British national, an imperial nationalism, which I would argue still endures to this day, despite what the left would like to say. And let's be frank, and I gestured to it earlier on, the left was as intimately involved with the deployment of violence as the right was. This is not a story about different political parties as much as Labour would like to think otherwise. And so I think in that sense, and even, I opened my remarks, but I was watching the Queen's funeral. I mean, this was truly an ethnographic event for me. And literally, empire is weighting down her coffin. And, so this imagery, this sense of empire, whether it's conscious or subconscious, is part of the day to day. I think that has, and I have to think more about this, Phil, but I think that has a lot to do with it. This endurance of this, no matter how unfashionable that may be, it still allows for what otherwise, if we go back to the Orwellian sense, would be a small island nation in the North Sea, an extraordinary, that had the largest empire in history, and an empire that has effectively, let's be frank, until really, as you're pointing out, the post-colonial theorists in particular in the 1990s, and this is not to discount memoirs and the rest, but more mainstream, if you will, mainstreaming into academia, discussions about empire and violence and Britain's empire and violence, that this endures with really very little critique for quite some time. Now, of course, during that moment, during the period that I'm writing about, of course, for myself and you and others, there are many critics in the moment, right? But they're a small minority. Let's be frank about that. Whether it's the far labor left, whether the Independent Labor Party, whether it's pacifists, whatever the case may be, but they do leave behind for the likes of us important evidence, and which is extremely useful. The other thing I want to raise is the question as to why, or in what way, the Kenyan, which was discussed a little bit, the Kenyan reparation case, and just in general about sort of moving the needle, if you will, on what's going on in sort of public imagination about empire. And, the thing is that the ability, and this gets back to sort of the intersectional scholarship, the ability to wage these cases is very, very limited. And it's limited on our work. Right. The Kenyan case was strictly, that was a revisionist history case. That was just a nerd off, if you will, between historians. Right. How can books like Imperial Reckoning and Histories of the Hanged stand the test of the courtroom? Right. And so in order to wage these claims, they have to demonstrate systematic violence and torture. And so it's up to us as historians to put these stories back together again in the absence of historical records, right? With the burning of the documents and the rest of it. And time is not on our side. And so once claimants, those who lived through these moments, pass away, the cases go away, right? It was ruled on in the Mau Mau case that these claims were not inheritable by the successors or the children or grandchildren of those who suffered these abuses. And so why I'm raising all of this is that it becomes, insofar as the court of law is a blunt instrument, and I really want to emphasize that, it is a blunt instrument. It's a fact or an act, or it's not. There's no subjectivity in the courtroom, and that created some challenges as an historian with this case. But insofar as the courtroom provides a useful arena, an alternative arena for reparations cases, there are going to be fewer and fewer of those happening because the claimants are going to be gone, and we don't have the same, we have to have the kind of evidence like we've got in the Kenyan books. Somewhat, the Cyprus case was somewhat successful, but not nearly on the same scale. I'll pause there because I'm sort of veering off a little bit, Philip, but I think getting back to the public imagination, the ability for us to continue publishing these works, but also for it to have impact. And that's going to be very hard when we think about the countervailing forces. The Sewell report would be one. And as you went through just the different, those who are coming in and out. And I think there's always a gross mistake to assume just because somebody is not from the dominant class of sort of, if you will, coming from sort of a white Anglo-Saxon background, that they're not part and parcel of whatever it is, the larger myth of the empire. And we certainly see this in the United States in different ways, right? Folks will point to, I was successful because of the opportunities afforded to me, and therefore the system works. And so I think it can be an and both. It can be the system has brought individuals in, but there's much to reconcile, and it's still playing out today. And obviously, whether it's Rhodes must fall or whatever the case may be, but it does bring us to this question about victimhood. And I know the review of which you speak, and look, I think a few things. One, I think that was a fairly unfair sort of attack, if you will. I don't know, it was an attack, a critique, because a few things. I think first, my experience in working on for now 25, 30 years, violence and extreme violence. And that is, it's very difficult to find in a torture cell where the agency is for that individual to subvert the coercive effects, or if you will, the victimhood. It is extreme, but and when you interview, and I've had the ability to interview many, they will tell you the same thing. So that's one. And I do bring the reader right into those moments, as you know from reading the book. This said, so that would sort of lend itself to this totalizing. There are totalizing moments of violence, not by all means all the time. What I am so struck by in my own work has been the degree to which, we talked briefly in our conversation about the exchange of ideas more from the implementing of violence and torture, but we've talked less about the exchange of ideas from, if you will, those who were subjected to coercion and torture. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it within colonial landscapes. There's a lot of it across colonial landscapes. And I think in that sense, the degree to which there is agency within, if you will, I'm being reductive now for the purposes of time, but agency within victimhood. We see it in the evidence that we use as historians. I couldn't write about this book were it not for detainee letters coming out of the detention camps, were it not for Greek Cypriot lawyers collecting evidence to provide to the Greek government so they could file a case against the Cypriots in the European Court of Human Rights, right? We couldn't talk about it. And so I think in that sense, the question becomes, to me at least, how is it that individuals are able to speak about and seek some kind of redress about the coercion that takes place? And I think we have this at the high level, right? With the European Convention case being filed against Britain in Cyprus. And then we have on the very lived experience, the day-to-day, if we go take ourselves into the detention camps, right? Why is it that the ability to communicate, the ability to negotiate, even in the smallest of way, brings some kind of reprieve? And I'm not talking about anything that's any different than what we see in other forms of confinement, whether historical or present day. So I think in that sense, I'm very sensitive to this question about victimhood. I think that there are certain moments where I would not want to put words into the mouths by any stretch of those who I interviewed or spent time with, but I think they themselves would find it very difficult to find when they're being tortured, where they would find that moment of, where they're not a victim in that instance. And they speak, I have had many, particularly in the Kenyan context, speak about their victimhood in relationship to their dignity. And the taking away of their dignity in their minds is equivalent to victimhood. And the case itself, and also in other cases, sort of the restoration of that dignity is also a way of, for them, of having agency and sort of reclaiming this notion of victimhood. I'll pause there, Philippa. We could sort of go on for a while. On any of these questions, we could spend quite some time because they're so wonderful. Your last one is on the question of enslavement. I'll give you the very short answer. This is an 850-page book. I mean, my editor would have lost his mind. It just was not happening. And so I think I also felt pretty strongly, I mean, as it was, the volume of literature, and I'm very clear about this in the introduction, and I want to be very clear in our conversation today, the degree to which some of the questions I'm raising, many of them these are not new. You pointed that out in your remarks, Phil, and I make that a strong point in the introduction. What I'm trying to do is kind of get my arms around what is a massive, massive amount of different literatures. Let's see what happens if they speak to each other, and then introducing some new, if you will, archival research to it. The thought of getting my arms around the literature on slavery, I probably, the first instance almost broke me. But again, short answer to some of this would be, I would take us back. Yes, I don't disagree. The specter of violence and slavery, the adherence to the rule of law, there are many similarities. I think my response would be, look, the 19th century, post-abolition and the 19th century, and this is where Mehta and others come in, we do see a rupture. We do see a change insofar as the notion of developmentalism. And I talk less, we've had less of a conversation here about sort of scientific racism and the rise of developmentalism, but it really does inscribe the language. And that is one thing I did go back and have a look at. And Gott's book was very helpful, not to mention like literally dozens and dozens of others who have worked in this area. And so we're not seeing an instance in Jamaica that you're bringing over enslaved populations to work your plantations and that you're going to develop them into a middle-class citizen like you are in Kenya in 1953. And I think the notion that you're going to have just wastage rates in, say, Kenya plantations in the 1940s, that you're better off working people to death, we just don't see, as you well know, we just don't see that, right? We see a different approach to it. And it's not to suggest it's not still extractive labor, but there's a different way of thinking about this. There's a different ideology around it. And I think in that sense, and I'll end on this point, which I want to make sure we don't come away from our discussion with the sense that I have a very kind of getting back to a totalizing sense of what liberal imperialism is. I make the point of saying it's a very big umbrella, right? Under which many, we can have sort of, if you will, again, a sort of a spectrum of thought about what people believe they were doing. But this, at the heart of this was a notion of ushering in backward childlike populations into the modern world. In the modern world is sort of my term, but right, developing them. And this is something that we see really growing in different ways. And frankly, still, as you well know, taking on new forms post-World War II at a time, and it kind of gets back to sort of how the myths endure, at a time when the myth today is still really about, at least in the public sphere, after World War II, there was this kind of gradual benign handover of empire, when in fact we see this is actually one of the most violent periods, and that developmentalist language of populations still being unable to stand on their own, which is driving the Labor government under Attlee to continue with their imperial resurgence policy. So I will pause there. These are all wonderful questions. I do think that there's probably a short article, getting to your point. I think it would be a very interesting theoretical article for somebody else out there to write, taking us from the period of enslavement, frankly, to the present day, and thinking about this arc and thinking about ideologically this arc, because I think it's an extremely important question that you raise. So thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to the audience, and many people are interested in joining the conversation. So first up, Stephen Shore, your hand is up. If you would unmute yourself, please pose a question.
A wonderful talk. I have two very brief questions. The first is, one thing you've not mentioned is the American Revolution, and I'd be interested in hearing your views on, did that have any effect on subsequent British imperial policy? And my major question, and this is something that was only briefly touched on in your presentation and in the responses, is basically liberal imperialism to me is an oxymoron. But I don't think you can really understand British imperialism unless you compare it with contemporary experiences of French, Italian, German, and Spanish colonialism, whether any distinctive British aspects of British imperialism?
Yes, and certainly I would invite others on the panel to join me on this. My response to the first one, the American Revolution, I only touch on it briefly in the book, only insofar as when we think about a turn away from, if you will, the first empire more towards the east. And it's not something that figures prominently other than, as I said, a turn toward what is considered the next empire, the second empire, with this idea of turning toward India and eventually, of course, to Africa and elsewhere. And yes, I would agree. Liberal imperialism, I certainly, I may have mentioned it in my remarks. I certainly say this in the book is an oxymoron, right? I think it's again, this dualism, it's this difficulty of getting our minds around this. I tend to shy away, and I'm curious what Dane and Philippa think about this. But I tend not to, I think the comparisons can be invidious with empires. To Philippa's point, I think often when comparisons are made, it's when we compare our, we sort of the British compare ourselves to, especially the bête noire, the French, we always end up on top. This still continues in our own profession. And that's why I said I'm not as inclined toward the balance sheet of empire as I am towards the sort of how and why this is happening within a liberal regime. And I gestured to, I believe it's in the introduction, of saying, of any of the empires, the British are probably most like the French. But there are also significant differences there as well. But I'm curious what some of my other fellow panelists think about that.
Sure, I'll jump in. And actually, this is in the context of the question that Philippa raised about why this nostalgia for empire is stronger in Britain than it is in these other European ex-empires. And that is, in fact, precisely the area where I think we do need to think comparatively about these empires. Now, I don't have a particular answer here, but it does occur to me, for example, that this enduring nostalgia is in some ways connected to the fact that Britain, unlike France, for example, didn't really go through a modern revolution, never became a republic, and monarchy remained, as you point out in your opening remarks, extraordinarily powerful as a symbol of empire. Mm-hmm. I also think if we compare it to France, for example, there is an interesting comparison between the British experience with Ireland and the French experience with Algeria. And they both are traumatic, but certainly the French experience is far more traumatic and has much more direct domestic political consequences, whereas Ireland, they shuff it off for the most part earlier, and they still retain part of it. But anyway, those are some very broad general thoughts that do speak to the need, I think, for thinking comparatively.
Philippa, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. Just very briefly. I mean, I think if we're going to think about the American Revolution in this context, for me, and I really will be brief, I can't think about the American Revolution without thinking about the nature of labor in 17th and 18th century America, and therefore about slavery and indenture and all of the other kinds of unfree and coerced and semi-coerced labor. So I can't think about the American Revolution kind of outside of that context. And so if I were to be trying to sort of put the American Revolution into this pattern, it would be, I think, via thinking about forms of labor. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Elizabeth Mankey, if you would unmute yourself, you can pose a question. Yes.
Okay, so you can hear me now?
Yes.
So it's my experience teaching Indigenous students here in Canada and Black students here in Canada that the issue of violence is so normative to their experience that a book like yours tells them not much that's new. And that fighting, so an Indigenous student who focuses on the violence never creates the foundation for moving forward constructively. So we've struggled with this problem. How do you write a history of Indigenous peoples that does not make the violence the central narrative, because the violence as the central narrative of their experience does not create a narrative that is forward-looking. And so to move forward positively and to recapture parts of their histories that are not intrinsically about violence is really the challenge. And so, and it's the same with Black students. And I have a Black student right now who's descended from Black loyalists. And with him, we've been able to make the break with the legacy of violence and making the violence the narrative. So it seems to me that the book you have written is really for the imperialists themselves, that it really is a demand for the imperialists to reckon with what the legacy of imperialism is, that it's more for us than it is for them, for those people who have experienced that violence.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. I think I'll respond with a little story on this, I suppose. I think one of the things that I was struck by when writing my first book, and this is not untrue in some of the other locations where I did research, and that was when I was doing interviews in the upcountry in Kenya, there were many instances where children and grandchildren of those who had fought during the period of Mau Mau didn't know why they weren't allowed to play with their next door neighbor. They didn't know why they didn't speak to the people on the other side of the ridge. They just knew they couldn't. Most of them did not know their parents had ever been detained. And many didn't know what actually detention meant. And in the case of the first book, and I mentioned in my opening remarks that really some of the purpose of that book was to establish something as fact. And I'm overwhelmed still to this day. It's really very humbling that, the amount of incoming that I'll get from individual Kenyans who for the first time have picked up the book or has seen something about it and will say, I still, this is now 15 years after the book. So I think my response to you is that I think we need to be careful about, and I'm not discounting by any means the lived experiences of your students, which are extraordinarily important. I'll get to that in a moment. But I think we need to be careful about, what does, who knows what and what does knowing mean? And the ability to chronicle different events of the past that are quite violent. And there are some that are more well known than others. I think we need to be careful about what people know locally. I do believe that it's unusual, even if we go back to the Kenyan context, where maybe individuals in the more younger generations didn't know what happened, but they knew something was wrong. And so I think the question that I would raise would be, yes, I think to your point, that in some ways this book is written for those, if you will, from, sort of more dominant populations who have held the power, who continue to potentially hold the power to inflict the kinds of violence that we've seen in the past. But I also think that there's something about documenting the past, and this gets into a much larger conversation, documenting the past and also acknowledgement of that past. And I think they're related, and that gets back to questions, not just about reparations, and I don't want to get us too far down that road, but part of when we think about, sort of, if you will, truth and reconciliation, what that means. What does it mean to accept new narratives into mainstream? What does it mean not just to accept those narratives into mainstream, but to make changes in the world in which we're living based upon those narratives? I think we're pretty far from that. And I think in that sense, I think that it's a careful navigation, as you're pointing out, but I also, I want to be careful about points that say, sort of not to create a narrative that isn't forward looking. I don't think, history is not about progress always, and certainly not in these instances. And I think we need to be careful and nuanced about how we're writing about it, extremely sensitive to the nature of the violence, but also I think establishing certain things as fact. And how and why those facts have unfolded, I think continue, and at least in my mind, to have some saliency. So that's sort of how I would initially respond. It's a terrific question, and I'll think about it some more. But I'd be delighted to also hand it over to my fellow panelists if they'd like to weigh in at all.
All right, then. Thomas Metcalf, your hand has been up. Please unmute, join the conversation. Go ahead.
You hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, I guess I was in this game in the very beginning. Dane was my student in the 1960s, and I've written on liberal imperialism on several occasions, as some of you may know. I had a couple of questions or reflections I wanted to put forward. One is, where is India in this book? As biggest colony the British ever had, ruled for 200 years. I mean, there are two classic instances of violence: the 1857 uprising, which was, of course, an uprising and therefore had to be put down, and the quite gratuitous 1919 Amritsar massacre. These are usually kept out as separate events. And I do wonder if we can talk about India in the context of this argument about violence. There was violence in the Northwest frontier, precisely of the legitimated kind that we're talking about, but not Gandhi, Nehru, a wholly different ball game, surely. And the second point really is that this is a book focused on the post 1920 period. One might argue that liberalism, imperialism was a little bit gentler. I don't know, in the earlier days. And by the 1920s and 30s, in places like Africa and Malaya, and especially Palestine, the British became anxious and fearful, and that led to, I think, a lot of this violence. And one group that's left out, missionaries, there's no sign of them. How do they fit into this game? There are lots of them out there. And I went to a talk by Peter Stancy on Orwell and Empire just a few weeks ago. And Orwell, was he an imperialist? Well, he claimed that he was not imperialist, but from his account of the nature of the Burmese people he encountered, it sounds pretty imperialist to me. So, I mean, there are a lot of games, a lot of sort of ambiguities, I think, in the whole thing.
Thank you very much. Carolyn, we've got about 3.5 minutes, maybe
Okay.
4, to cover a lot of ground.
I'll quickly tour through them. First of all, what an honor and privilege to have these questions. Ideologies of the Raj was a favorite of mine for many years in graduate school, and so I feel like I'm speaking to one of the icons right now. So it's lovely to have you participating with us. Just very briefly, the book does touch on pretty much everything that you just raised. I mean, we've sort of touched on certain elements of it. Poor Philippa said she had to take notes. I mean, it is a lengthy kind of read, and absolutely, I mean, India figures very prominently at different points. 1857 and 1919 are two, and I'll just acknowledge this without getting into too much detail. And certainly, and also the Northwest frontier, all of these, and in fact, the Northwest frontier and aerial bombing and also figure prominently. I think I would raise the point about post 1920 period as sort of a differentiation. I would urge us to maybe to think about where would we then place the South African War, for example, which figures quite prominently, or the Boer War in the book from 1899 to 1902, which is quite important, actually, in sort of the evolution of some of the structures and practices that I'm talking about. And obviously, we certainly have, a variety of things happening again straddling, certainly right after World War I, moving from Egypt to Ireland to elsewhere. And so I think I would certainly see my own self, the period I would extend us from really the South African War until the 1930s, which I do in the book, right? I mean, insofar as taking us in terms of periodizing it. So I'm not so sure I would agree with the 1920 split, but I do think that certainly post World War II provides us with some new issues insofar as legal norms. But I tend to, and again, this is for probably a longer discussion. I see a much more of an arc going from the 19th century into the post-World War II period, a point that I made earlier. And I would urge us just to think carefully about World War II or even 1920 being too much of a dividing line within all of this. The missionaries, yes, they certainly, they pop up in the book. They come in more at the end. I tend to bring people in at different moments. They're particularly useful, I would say, particularly in the context of in the earlier period in the 1930s, in the Arab Revolt, they become important individuals. I'm less interested in the book itself with the missionaries insofar as conversion or attempts thereof, as opposed to what is their role in bearing witness to providing evidence about how they themselves understand and internalize the violence that's going on around them, and how do they reconcile it with the work that they're doing. And last but not least, Orwell, absolutely, he's very much a thread through all of this. I think my own self, one of my favorite chapters is when it opens up when he's in writing actually 1984, and I think he is conflicted certainly about empire. At the same time, I think you're hard pressed to find somebody who, even in his own conflicted nature with empire, who provides such a prescient set of critiques about the empire. And so I know that there are a bunch of folks who are working on this right now, including, I think, Priya Satya and some others. And I just am marveling at that work and really excited for when some of it comes out, because they will do far better justice. He comes in at different points for me in the book, as opposed to being an object of sort of sustained study itself. But most of all, thank you again for those questions.
And I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. There's so much more we could talk about. There are 687 pages of text, and we have but scratched the surface of so many of the examples and arguments that are in these very, very rich pages. So I want to thank Carolyn, Philippa, and Dane, and Christian for this session, as well as those in the audience. My apologies to those of you whose questions we could not get to. And with that, I'm turning this back to Christian for final words. Sir.
Just to say thanks on my part to Caroline, Dane, and Philippa, and to invite everyone to next week's Washington History Seminar, October 31st, with a conversation about Timothy Schenk's new book, Realigners. Thanks again. We're adjourned. Stay safe. Take care.